everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Maria Desimone. I am your astrology teacher today here for the Stormie Grace YouTube Academy. I could not be more honored and excited to talk to all of you today about one of my favorite branches of astrology, predictive astrology. I absolutely love predictive astrology. And you guys, you've been taking these classes. You are ready. You're ready to take this leap. And here I am with you. I'm going to push you guys off the cliff. Don't be nervous because I know you're going to get so much out of this. Now, you've been watching the videos with other teachers. You are at the level now of aspect analysis. And if you are okay looking at anybody's birth chart and delineating their natal aspects, then you, my friend, are ready to take this next step. Because all a transit is a temporary aspect. A transit is all it is the planets in the sky at any given moment in time and how those planets interact and dance with your natal birth chart. It's very, very simple to take that switch and flip it in your brain from aspect analysis to transit analysis when you remember that these are simply temporary aspects that are happening in your world or anybody's world that you're reading for. So how do transits even work in astrology? Well, they work by either waking up what is known as the natal promise in your birth chart, or by creating enough of this energetic mix with your natal chart to stimulate physical events. And I have a couple of fabulous book recommendations. I talk about the natal promise a lot, and that is something, the concept that I got from one of my favorite books, The Art of Predictive Astrology by Carol Rushman. So she goes into detail about the natal promise and taught me that if it's not there in your chart, there is no possibility of it really unfolding. And when is it going to unfold? That's what we want to know. And transits can tell that story. So transits, those temporary aspects in the sky, are going to wake up your natal birth chart and create these physical events, manifest them into your world. So there's some other recommended reading I'm going to get out of the way very quickly. Another excellent book on predictive astrology, Bernadette Brady, Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark. Anything by Celeste Teal. I'm a huge fan. Celeste Teal, Predicting Events with Astrology, Identifying Planetary Triggers. These books will make you a very competent predictive astrologer. Remember though, transits, which we're talking about today, is the first step in predictive analysis. In order to become an absolutely stellar, accurate predictive astrologer, you really need that perfect trifecta of transits, progressions, secondary progressions, and solar arc directions at your disposal. And that is what I use in my practice and in my work when I am making those predictions for people on an everyday basis. But it starts with transits, and you're going to see by the end of this class that you can make some pretty accurate predictions using the transits alone. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's start with some of these slides here, and let's review planetary motion, because the planetary motion is important to understand against a birth chart. The personal planets move very quickly, and you may already know this from studying aspects and other classes. But these personal planets, the sun through Mars, they're quick, they're fast in the sky. And that means while they do have an effect in your world on a physical level, it is a quick moving, fast pacing situation with these personal planets. They're not going to linger. They're not going to hang around and cause any major life event. They're going to support the major life event. We will get to that. The social planets, the middle guys, I like to call these the middlemen, Jupiter and Saturn. Now we're getting to planets that are slower in their motion. Jupiter takes around 12 years to go around the sun. Saturn stays in each sign for about 2.5 years. Okay, so Jupiter has a 12-year cycle. It takes about 12 years to go through each sign. Now they're slowing down. So now these social planets, Jupiter and Saturn, have an effect where you're going to notice it a little bit more. Definitely a Saturn transit. But the outer planets, the transpersonal planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, these guys are, without question, the heavy hitters in transit work and in predictive astrology. Paying attention to these slow outer planet transits are going to clue you in to those moments in your life of major life change. But those outer planets have to touch your personal planets or an angle in your chart for the major life events to unfold. And we will come back to that. We're going to spend most of the class focusing on transits from planets in the sky to a planet or angle in your birth chart. But first, I want to mention transits through the houses of your birth chart, because you can actually get a really nice idea, a general theme of what's going on in someone's life when you take the transiting planets in the sky and put them into a birth chart and see what house they're falling on. So there is a handout available to you that talks about transiting planets in the house. And the sun, it's going to stay in any house for a short amount of time, and that's just going to shine a light in that area of your life for that brief month-long or so journey. Then you've got the lunar transits. It's just a very quick emotional focus. It's really nothing unless it's an eclipse, maybe a lunation, a new moon, or a full moon, but we'll get to that. Then you've got your Mercury transits, and that's going to stimulate a mental focus in a certain area of your life for a little while. The Venus transits are going to stimulate aesthetics and harmony in that area of your life. Questions of values and worth may come into play in that area of your life for a brief moment in time. The Mars transits will stimulate, you're going to say, okay, this is what I'm focused on right now with those Mars transits. So whatever house Mars is transiting through in your chart, you're energized. Now, I also want to mention Mars is inflammatory. So Mars is going to stimulate you. It's going to energize the house that it touches in your chart, but it's also going to potentially aggravate it and inflame it, because remember, Mars is the planet of war and can be anger. So keep that in mind when you're looking at those Mars transits. The Jupiter transit that you're getting is going to stimulate a growth opportunity in an area of your life. So remember, guys, the function of Jupiter is just to blow up what it touches. Jupiter does not discriminate good or bad. It's going to hang around what's there and blow it up. But even if it's a difficult situation, Jupiter has so much of that growth opportunity that you tend to kind of land on your feet. But you want to drive these transits as much as possible. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how you can use some free will when you are dealing with the transit energy. And I will get to that when I get into the examples for prediction, because I'm always guiding clients on how can you use your transits to maximize the positive energy and discharge some of the shadow, difficult energy that might be at play if there is a hard cycle that you're going through. So going back to the planets, transiting planets in the houses, a Saturn transit, whatever house Saturn is transiting through, in your chart is going to talk about where you need to get real, where you need to be mature and responsible. Saturn wants you to master whatever it's touching. Saturn doesn't want you to fail, even though it feels like that. But Saturn's going to trigger your insecurities. Saturn's going to trigger your greatest fears. And there is this karmic obligation to your soul to roll up your sleeves with any Saturn transit and say, all right, here we are. Let's keep it real and let's do the work. And that's what your focus needs to be in whatever house Saturn happens to be transiting for you. And then we have Uranus transits, which are going to wake you up like nothing else. Uranus transits are going to stimulate chaos in your life, possibly, but will also very likely stimulate revolution and liberation in whatever house it is transiting. Then a Neptune transit is going to stimulate the sensitizing, spiritual aspect of that area of your chart. But it can also confuse the heck out of you. Whatever house Neptune is going through in your chart can suddenly become elusive, bewildering, really difficult to touch and hold on to. So you may feel like there is that quicksand feeling or erosion, and you have to surrender to a higher power and let go of something related to that area of your chart so that you can become more compassionate, more sensitized, more spiritualized. And then there is the Pluto transit. Pluto is the slowest moving planet. So obviously Pluto is going to spend a very long time in any particular house in your chart. And Pluto transits are going to stimulate intensity. Pluto intensifies anything it touches. And it's going to stimulate lessons around power and empowerment. But Pluto can cause a lot of annihilation, decimation, destruction in an area of your life in order to force you to confront that dance of the correct use of power in your world. So that's a brief overview of transiting planets in any house to look at. But when you are doing your predictive work, even this, the transiting planets in a house, it's kind of like a supporting role. So for example, if you are making a prediction that somebody is going to get married, they might have Jupiter through Pluto, one of those planets moving through their seventh house, or in relation to a planet that's in their seventh house, let's say. But that is a supporting transit. The fact that Saturn is in your seventh house doesn't mean you're going to get married by itself, doesn't mean you're going to get divorced by itself. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay. The real meat and potatoes in predictive astrology, as we talk about transits in particular, I've narrowed it down into a fun little language. So I call this is how you determine the weight of planets in transits. There are certain transits that are the ultimate boss. And the sooner you learn how to determine which transits are the boss and which transits are not the boss, but have maybe a supporting role, that is how you're going to become a really competent predictive astrologer. Because you're not going to make a major life prediction for anybody based on a transiting personal planet touching something in anyone's chart. It doesn't work that way. It's the opposite. And the sooner you understand this number one rule, you're on your way. So in order for any major life event to occur in a native's life, a transiting outer planet to a natal personal planet or an angle must occur. I'm going to say that again. Burn it into your brain, please. A major life event cannot manifest in the native's life unless there is a transiting outer planet, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, to a natal personal planet, Sun through Mars, or an angle in their chart. When you start to see those transits for your clients, for yourself, you know something major is cooking in your world. But the other transits have a vital role as well. So the boss transit is the transiting outer planet to a personal planet or an angle. I also call a boss transit any eclipse that occurs within a reasonable orb to a natal personal planet or an angle. That gets boss status. And we're going to talk about orb in a second. But after the boss transits, we need, every boss needs staff, right? You need to have people helping you make the magic happen that you're trying to accomplish. So the staff transits to look out for are Jupiter and Saturn transits. So transiting social planets to natal personal planets are going to always corroborate the theme that is symbolized by the boss transit that you're looking at, or boss transits, as we'll see, because it's usually more than one. And then there's even more. To fine-tune your predictions and to get within a week of an event happening, a day, even the day of an event happening, here is when those personal transiting planets come into play. This is when the magic happens, because you're going to get the main theme, the main event of, okay, you're getting a promotion. Okay, you're buying a house. The boss transit's going to show it. The staff transit's going to corroborate it. And you're going to know that that's a year, let's say, for a person to likely have that event manifest in their life. But it is the personal planets, the transiting personal planets to your chart that is going to be what I call the fact checkers, the supporting evidence of, okay, here's when it's going to happen. And we'll see examples of that. So transiting personal planets to natal planets or angles are going to act in those supporting roles and will often occur on the day or close to the day that the actual life event transpires. And you may have heard this, it's called triggers. These guys are the triggers, and they help refine exact timing. And keep in mind, notorious triggers are Mars, transiting Mars, because Mars stimulates something into action or inflames it, aggravates it. And Saturn transits can actually also, even though that's a staff transit, Saturn transits can really work well with these boss transits to push the energy into manifestation. And eclipses, lunations and eclipses. This is when you really want to work with those lunations and eclipses to see when is something likely to happen. So let's talk about orbs. You already are familiar with orbs, guys. You've studied aspects. You're deciding on the orbs that you're using in your chart, natal chart analysis. And when I teach aspects to my students, when I start to talk about the concept of orb, I actually teach just because I like to teach my students how to find, locate aspects by hand and draw them into a chart. So it's a little easier to do that when you learn on a wide orb. But I am very clear from the beginning that that's just so that you can learn how to find those aspects and hand draw those aspects in a chart, because that's how you're connecting to the soul. Sounds a little flaky, but it's true. Try it if you haven't tried it. Hand drawing somebody's Sun square Pluto makes you feel it, okay, rather than just looking at it on a piece of paper. So having said that, I really do prefer tight orbs, but I am not married to my orbs. And I want you to take that approach. I want you to have a guideline for yourself that works for you in your practice, and understand that there are going to be times when you intuitively know when to break your rules. So I do prefer tight orbs in predictive astrology, especially because it tightens your accuracy as a predictive astrologer. And remember, those outer planet transits are going to last a long time for someone. So there is an unfolding storyline, and you're trying to guide your client to, well, when is this main event happening? And if you're using a very wide orb, a 7-degree orb, let's say, for a Pluto transit, it's like you're shooting in the dark. You're not going to get that refined timing that we're looking for in predictive astrology. So when it comes to transits, my recommended orbs are these. For a boss transit, remember, boss transits, the outer planets to a personal planet or an angle, I prefer to use an applying transit orb of 3 to 4 degrees, and then a separating transit orb of 2 to 3 degrees. I'm not sure if you already discussed applying transits and separating transits, applying and separating aspects rather, in other classes, but briefly, the applying aspect is when the slower the slower moving planet comes, when we're talking about a transit. Let's say we're looking at transiting Uranus conjunct the sun. So Uranus is slow. The sun is fast. So Uranus applying, moving towards the sun, the applying transit is when it's moving towards that planet that it's touching. The separating transit is when it is moving away. So when it is either now gone retrograde and is moving away from the sun, or when it's past and is moving on and you're done. Okay, so you want to have a little bit of a tighter orb for a separating transit if it is the final mathematical hit of that transit. Because if it's the final hit, you know you're moving on and it is not going to come back anymore. And we'll talk about those mathematical hits and the final hits in a few minutes. I will get to all of it. So those boss transits, if you can tighten your orbs, 3 or 4 degrees applying, 2 to 3 degrees separating, that's going to give you a level of, okay, let's control the chaos here that we're looking at in our time searches. Then the staff and the fact checker transit orbs, my recommendation is for an applying transit 2 to 3 degrees, and for a separating transit 1 to 2 degrees. Because especially those fact checkers, those personal planets, they're moving quick, they're gone. So they go and that's it. Now, let us talk about responsible prediction. I wish I knew the source for this. And if anybody knows the source, please tell us, enlighten us. But I remember reading this somewhere along the lines of in my astrology studies or hearing about it. And I wish I could remember the source, but I can't. But this concept called the rule of 3 is gold. It is gold, and it is my ethical basis for making predictions. I don't care how much my intuitive abilities are kicking in. I don't care what I think I'm seeing in someone's chart. I don't care how much I want to tell them something's happening because I want this great thing to happen for them. If the rule of 3 is not active, I do not make a major life prediction. So what is the rule of 3? In order to become the most accurate and ethical predictive astrologer you can be, please consider following the rule of 3, which states that before you make any major life prediction, you are seeing the theme represented by at least 3 times. And the theme representing the prediction that you're making can occur in a horoscope by any combination of boss transits, secondary progressions, and solar arc directions. So I understand that right now in this class, we're just getting started with predictive astrology. So all you have to work with right now are transits. So there is going to be a little bit of a limitation for you in giving accurate predictive information for these major life events based on the transits alone. But you're going to see in my chart examples later that there are times when the transits are hopping and that's all you need. But as long as you have 3 cycles, any combination, at least 3, you can feel confident that that major life event is on the person's trajectory. It just is. And usually you're going to see many more than 3, but it has to be a minimum of 3. And it should, to be the most accurate. And I'm really stressing accuracy and mechanics here right now, because once you refine your technique, you're going to see that this helps you help your client. Please consider that it has to be a combination of those boss transits, outer planet transits to the angles of personal planets, and then important secondary progressions and solar arcs, which we really can't get into in this class. But do not ever, and I have seen this mistake over and over and over again with astrology students who are so excited about making predictions. They will see something like, transiting Venus is conjunct my sun, or my 7th house cusp, or just moved into my 5th house. I'm going to meet a new love. No, honey bunch. No, 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 no. Do not make a major prediction off of one little fact checker transit. That is a mistake. Put the planets in their proper place. That fact checker transit of Venus moving to conjunct your sun, or conjunct your 7th house cusp, or 5th house, whatever it is, that has a supporting role for the main event. That is not telling you that the main event of you meeting a new love is going to happen, but it does have a role. So please do not make a major life prediction off of only a staff transit, Jupiter or Saturn, or a combination of a staff and a fact checker transit, because that's not enough. Can you look at Saturn going through someone's 7th house and they get a divorce? Absolutely. Can you look at Jupiter going through someone's 5th house and they get pregnant? Absolutely. But that transit should never be the reason you're making that prediction. That's what I'm trying to say. Hopefully you can follow this, and it's starting to all come together. So let's talk about a transit storyline and how to determine the transit storyline. Excuse me. So all of these transits tell a unique, rich story in a person's birth chart. And I love digging into that, because you can get so many details. The way that you begin to determine anybody's transit storyline is you want to first note the house location of the transiting planet and the natal planet that you're looking at. Then you want to consider the house that the transiting planet and the natal planet rules in the birth chart, because that's going to add juice and layers and complexity to this transit storyline. And all you have to do is stick to your keywords that you've learned in those beginner classes and be true to the astrology here. Because if you're sticking to those keywords and you're being true to the astrology, you're not making this up, guys. You are following the technical rules of this language, and they will lead you to accurate predictive storylines. So after you consider those two factors. You want to think about, are the transiting aspects that I'm looking at here mainly hard aspects? Squares, oppositions, conjunctions. Conjunctions can go either way. You have to look at the big picture. If it's a conjunction, a transiting conjunction, along with a square and an opposition, you know this is hard stuff. If it's a transiting conjunction and then there's a trine and a sextile, there's supportive good stuff. So those hard transits suggest a difficult storyline. And although we all wish that we can paint unicorns and rainbows for our clients and for ourselves and the people that we love when we're looking at their astrology, that's not reality. Our job as astrologers, our job as predictive astrologers, is to accurately and compassionately deliver the information that is available to us, not to paint a rosier picture just because we want someone to feel better. You're not being helpful if you do that. So are these transiting aspects mainly supportive with little to no hard transits, or are they mostly difficult? That's how you're going to know, is this a positive storyline or is this a difficult storyline that we're looking at? And I like to do a time search for a client of about 12 to 15 months with my software. And what I do with my software is I program it to look at transits Jupiter through Pluto to those personal planets and angles, the Jupiter through Pluto. And then I will go use my Ephemeris to eyeball those smaller transits and eclipses. Some years in a person's life are going to be what I call crisis years. And I do have an example later on in a chart of a crisis year to show you, a couple actually. Crisis years are filled with adversity, major loss, major tragedy, and struggle for someone. And there are years that look like that for some people. Then some years are what I call golden years. And the golden years are filled with opportunities and blessings. And it's kind of like you feel like you can do no wrong. Everything is lining up and you want to maximize your transits. You want to maximize your cycles during those opportunity golden years. Most years, however, are just living your life years. And it's going to be a combination of, there's a couple of hard transits, there's a couple of nice supportive transits. Let's blend this all together and we're just living our life. That's most years, and you'll see that. So you want to identify which year, what kind of a year does this feel like for the person? And I want you to keep in mind that even a blessing, such as a marriage, a career opportunity, the birth of a child, even something as wonderful as this will show at least one hard transit. Why? Because any life-altering time in your world invites developmental tension. You have to have some kind of developmental tension for these major life changes. And even the good stuff can be stressful. Okay, so the Ephemeris. I think it is very important to learn how to read an Ephemeris when you are doing predictive work, when you're working with transits. And when I do my client work, I have my file. I print out a birth chart. I print out my transit progression and solar arc time search of 12 to no more than 15 months ahead. And then I'll print out a standalone progress chart, sometimes a standalone solar arc directed chart. And I always use a solar return chart, which I'll get to at the end, because to me, planetary return charts, the solar return in particular, is a one-year theme chart that is like the cherry on top of your predictive ice cream sundae. And I will illustrate that later on. But what I also have, besides that folder that I just mentioned, is my Ephemeris. I'm going to be buried with this ephemeris. I'm telling you. I don't even know if they sell this ephemeris anymore. I don't think they do. So you can have an ephemeris for noon or midnight, and that talks about the moon's positions. I prefer a midnight ephemeris. That's what I learned on. And that shows the moon's position at midnight and at noon in the ephemeris. And I tried to print out a page in the ephemeris for you for one of your handouts. It may not be as clear as I'd like, but the reason why I printed this out is because even though you're going to have that time search of your transits, it is the ephemeris that's going to be your fact checker. And you're always going to find yourself going back and looking and double checking. And here's why. When you look in an ephemeris at a planet's positions, you're able to see what day the planet changes signs. You're able to see what day a planet goes retrograde, what day a planet stations direct. This is critical because those boss transits are always going to have multiple mathematical exact hits that will define the progression of the storyline. And even the staff transits can. So Jupiter through Pluto, which are the main transits that you're looking at for predictive astrology, those transits can have 3 mathematical hits. You are guaranteed to get 3 mathematical hits from a Uranus transit, and you are guaranteed to get a minimum of 3 exact mathematical hits with a Neptune and a Pluto transit. However, rarely a Neptune or a Pluto transit can actually give you 5 mathematical hits. And this is why you need to have your ephemeris with you, because you don't want to miss that. You could be thinking in your time search, oh, there's this Neptune transit. Neptune is conjunct someone's Venus. Wow, it happens on this date, happens on this date, and then it happens on this date. Done. Then you come to realize, oh, I didn't look ahead farther enough, or I didn't look behind farther enough. And there are actually 5 mathematical hits in total. And that's something you don't want to miss, because that is a critical part of that person's storyline and life, and needs to be considered in your predictive analysis. So that's another reason why I suggest having your ephemeris. Another reason why I suggest having your ephemeris nearby is because, as you can see on the sheet, the bottom columns, the one that I'm looking at in particular, are the phases of the moon and the eclipses. I always highlight the eclipses for a particular year in my ephemeris. They're always highlighted so I can easily see them. But you want to eyeball when you're making those predictions, are any of those eclipses within close mathematical orb to my client's personal planets, angles. And for an eclipse, I prefer the conjunction, the square, or the opposition as really heavy boss transits, but you're going to play around with it, because as astrology teachers, we're giving you guidelines, but none of us are the be all and end all. And this is what I love about what Stormie's doing. There are so many teachers offering their wisdom to you, and your job as a student is to take what really resonates, what makes sense for you as a student, and apply that in your own practice, in your own work. And so you may decide in your experience that an eclipse that makes a trine to a personal planet is really important. I have a different opinion, but I'm not the be all end all. Okay. There are certain guidelines that I say, yeah, you really want to listen to this. And then there are times that I tell you, you want to dabble and experiment. So this is one of those times when you can do that, but you must look at those eclipses. And so you've got your ephemeris, and ephemeris is going to tell you when there is an important retrograde cycle, because Venus and Mars retrogrades are interesting to look at. when you're putting everything together in your predictive analysis. So consider that. Make sure you know how to read an ephemeris. Now, let's see. It's time to get to some fun chart examples. I think I've covered everything I wanted to up until this point of us now digging into some charts so that you can see all of this in action. And I didn't pick celebrity charts for these examples that I'm giving you. I chose my own chart and I chose a close friend of mine. The reason why I do that is because I know the nuances, the details of the transit of the storyline, and it helps to really educate you on the fact that you can see the astrology come to life in personal examples. Okay, so I have my birth chart that Stormie can put up, and you can take a quick look at my birth chart, but what's really going to help you is looking at the BiWheel. I realize this may be the first time you're being exposed to a BiWheel. So let me explain what that is. All right, so a BiWheel, you're going to be looking at BiWheels a lot, and some of you are then going to graduate and look at tri-wheels and maybe even quad wheels. Quad wheels make me nuts. I don't know how you guys look at them. Bless you, those astrologers that do. I actually have a personal preference of looking at a BiWheel for something and then looking at a standalone chart and comparing it, because I tend to see it better that way. But by all means, if you're someone who can look at a tri-wheel and a quad wheel and get it all down, you do that, you go. So in transits, we're just working with the BiWheel now, because we are only looking at the birth chart and the transits around it. So the inner wheel of a BiWheel is a birth chart, and the outer wheel represents the planets that are transiting at whatever day that you're talking about, you're looking at in a BiWheel. So this first BiWheel is my wedding day back in on November 2nd, 1997. And I had the exact time, all of that. And for an astrologer to look at your aspects, your transits, and say, hey, this is a marriage year for you, Maria. If I was sitting with an astrologer that year, just based on the transits, an astrologer can actually see this. And that's why I chose this example. Now, I will say there were about a half a dozen solar arcs and progressions in addition to these major transits that I'm going to share with you. And you will see that, which is why you've got to have that whole trifecta for the best predictive analysis. But these examples I chose because they show the events very strong with transits alone, using the method that I'm recommending. So on my wedding day, I got married. So what are you going to look at if you're predicting someone's marriage? This is where you've got to be a master at birth chart analysis first, because you have to know where to look if you're going to make a prediction. So if we're predicting marriage, we're going to look at Venus, which rules love and marriage for anybody. We're going to look at the 7th house, because the 7th house is the house of commitment and marriage. We're going to consider the person's 7th house ruler, the planet that rules your 7th house in your chart, where it is and what transits are happening to it. And we're going to consider any planets that are in the 7th house, if you have any. So looking at my birth chart, I have the planet Uranus exactly conjunct my 7th house cusp. I have Libra on my descendant on the 7th house cusp, which means the planet Venus rules my 7th house. So Venus, the natural ruler of love and marriage, rules my 7th house. So it makes it a little easier. So we are looking to see that those places are hit in order to predict a marriage. And sure enough, in this BiWheel, November 2nd, you can see that in multiple ways. You can see that transiting Pluto, Remember, we're looking for the boss transits first. Transiting Pluto is making a trine to my natal Venus. Trine, easy, supportive aspect. And it is almost exact. It's about a half a degree at the time that I got married. That's one boss transit. Transiting Uranus is making a sextile to my natal Venus. Why is that extra important? Well, natally, I have Uranus on the 7th house cusp. So by transit, a planet that I have natally on my 7th house cusp is aspecting the ruler of my 7th house cusp. You want to look at that. That's very important to consider. So there's that exact sextile of Uranus to my Venus. There's another boss transit, and this one is a hard one. Transiting Neptune is square my ascendant-descendant axis at the time of my marriage. So you can start to see from these 3 transits, which are all boss transits, that there's a storyline unfolding, right? And if you go back to the very beginning of this lecture, when I talked about what Carol Rushman says in her book about the natal promise, always consider the natal promise when you're making predictions, because sometimes these transits are waking up very strongly what's promised in the natal chart. Look at the tightest aspect that's in my birth chart. Venus opposite Pluto, right? Now that is a difficult aspect, which you're really going to see how difficult it became when I got divorced, which is the next chart, but stay with me for now. So Venus, the ruler of my marriage sector, is opposite Pluto. And the day I got married, transiting Pluto was in my 8th house, husband's money, transformation, making a trine, the most supportive aspect you can make, to my natal Venus, waking up this transit that I have natally. How did it wake it up? Well, I married a very wealthy man. So this was kind of my rags to riches story at that time in my life. I married a man who was very successful, and his family was very wealthy. And that changed my life instantly, overnight. And that's reflected by the fact that Pluto is transiting my 8th house, making that supportive link to the ruler of my 7th. Then Uranus is sextile my Venus, symbolizing the sudden change in my marriage status. I have natal Uranus on the 7th house cusp. So for me, Uranus is always active when I have a major relationship beginning or ending, always. And that was my Uranus transit. And the square of Neptune to my ascendant-descendant axis, see, the ascendant-descendant axis is going to be active when you get married, when you get divorced. Okay, pay attention to that. That symbolized the delusional part, the, oh my gosh, I'm living in this fairy tale now. And what started to erode as a result of my getting married was my identity, my ascendant. I gave up the Aries part of me, the ambitious career woman. I dropped out of graduate school, all of that, to get married, start a family, and live this very different lifestyle than what I was brought up in. Supporting transits on this day just happened to be that the Sun and Mercury are in my 7th house of marriage when I got married. And a side note, you can see that Venus and Mars are conjunct in the 9th house of the chart. They're small transits. Remember, I said these are tiny. They're not going to last a long time, a Mars transit or a Venus transit. But they're both trine my ascendant. which would be sextile my descendant, sextile my Uranus. And it is noteworthy to say that right after we got married, we took a 3-week honeymoon in Hawaii. So that symbolizes the international travel right there. And we also bought a house next door to my in-laws and did massive renovations, which is symbolized by Jupiter sextile my moon when I got married. Okay, so you can see the transits alone tell the story if you know where to look. So that's the wedding day. Now let's look at the divorce. Oh no, before we get divorced, we have kids. Okay, I have to go in order. Sorry, guys. I just wanted to jump right to the divorce. But no, first I had 2 kids, but I'm showing you the chart of only one because this particular birth symbolizes what I was saying before about this is a major blessing, but you're going to see some major stress. And the storyline unfolds as to why. So I gave birth to my first child, my son, and the outer wheel is the day I gave birth to him, the transits for that day against my birth chart, which is the inner wheel. If you're giving birth to a child, if you're having a child, what are you going to look for? As a predictive astrologer, how do you say, okay, this is going to be a year where you're having a baby? What needs to be activated? You have to know where to look. We're looking at the 5th house. We're looking at the 5th house ruler. We're looking at any planets in your 5th house. And we are looking at the moon for fertility. And the angles can be active in any major life event because your life is going to change. And the angles are points of energy manifestation, period. So always consider that no matter what you're trying to predict, if those angles are active, it's on. So look at what happened when I gave birth to my son. Transiting Saturn exactly conjunct my natal sun. The sun is the ruler of my 5th house. Boy, is that a responsibility transit. You go from being childless to being a mother for the first time, to being a parent, being the authority over this new life. Saturn conjunct the sun. And that is a weighty transit by itself. That is actually a staff transit, right? Remember, I said you're not going to make a prediction just on a Saturn transit or on a Jupiter transit, but that is the first transit that you might notice, the tight conjunction there. The boss transits are incredible. Transiting Pluto is almost exactly conjunct my natal moon in the 8th house. We talked about my 8th house when I got married in terms of husband's money. Now we're going to talk about 8th house in terms of death and transformation and surgeries, surgical procedures. And the moon, it rules your stomach, and the moon rules fertility. Pluto, death. That's a scary transit to look at, isn't it? And Pluto is the ruler of my 8th house. And so when I gave birth to my son, he almost died. It was an all-natural childbirth. I was, crazy warrior Maria who didn't want drugs. So I stayed home all day in labor and didn't tell anybody that I was in labor because I knew that if I went to the hospital too early, they would force me to have the drugs. I wanted a home birth, but that's a whole other conversation. I get to the hospital. I was almost fully dilated. And the doctor said, I'm sorry, I can't give you anything. I said, fine, I didn't want anything. So I was pushing. And as I was pushing, all of a sudden, he stopped breathing. And I started struggling with breathing as well. So the doctor had to perform an emergency C-section where I had to be put out under anesthesia. And he had seconds. My son was about to be brain dead. He had, I don't know if it's 90 seconds. It was emergent, life and death. And he saved my son's life. And that is so reflective of that Pluto moon conjunction that's happening when I gave birth. But we're going to see the stimulation of it this chart shows you how you refine to the day almost of when something can happen. But let's keep on with the themes. Transiting Uranus is square my sun, my natal sun, ruler of my 5th house when this happens. So that's another boss transit. The sudden events, the sudden going into labor, the sudden events that were happening. Okay, so I went into labor 7 days before my due date. So that shows there. Now look at all of the planets transiting through the 5th house. Mars, by the way, is opposite my sun, and that is aggravating. It's inflammatory. It's stimulating this birth in a very life and death dark way. Mars in Scorpio opposite my sun in Taurus. Sun is the ruler of the 5th house. See that? Okay. Look at everything in the 5th house now. What you may not realize until I tell you is that my son was born at the heels of a solar eclipse, a very, very significant solar eclipse in Leo, which you can see. And that solar eclipse was exactly square my sun, ruler of my 5th house. And that solar eclipse occurred in my 5th house of children. So an astrologer who's looking to see, all right, her due date's the 17th. Is she going to go into labor earlier? Is she going to go later? You see something like an eclipse happening around the time of someone's due date. Oh boy, do you know that that's going to stimulate the birth. Boom. And it sure did. Now, I didn't know astrology back then, but it sure did. Amazing. Really amazing example of the transits at work. And remember, an eclipse is a boss transit. So there were 3 boss transits the day that I had my son. Pluto conjunct the moon, Uranus square the sun, and the eclipse in my 5th house square my sun, ruler of the 5th house. And then there was the Saturn conjunct the sun, which was a staff transit. And then you see the fact checker transits. Mars is there stimulating it all, aggravating everything. This is a great example. And then we had a couple of kids, all was well, life went on, and then we got divorced. And now we get to the divorce chart, which the day we got divorced was March 11th, 2011. But we had a 4-year divorce battle. Why did we have a 4-year divorce battle? Go back to my natal chart and my natal promise, and that Venus opposite Pluto. And that is a very, very War of the Roses, dark, fight to the death transit about money, about secrets, about betrayal. I mean, forget it. We can have a whole soap opera here talking about that. Venus in the 12th house opposite Pluto. But this isn't a soap opera. This is a class. So I'm going to keep it technical. The divorce day, even though we had a 4-year divorce battle, the day I got divorced, the judge literally locked us into the courtroom. He was so tired of it. This judge said, "You're not leaving until this divorce is finalized." So we had no choice but to get divorced that day and to agree and stop fighting on things we were fighting about. Now look at the astrology here. There are multiple boss transits happening the day I got divorced. The first boss transit, I know you haven't studied midpoints yet. Some of you may not have heard of midpoints yet, but I want you to take the idea of a midpoint and put a pin in it, and understand that when you get to the level of understanding midpoints, transits to certain midpoints are very significant. In particular, there is a midpoint called the Sun-Moon midpoint, which is highly active during important relationship transitions in your life. And on the day of my divorce, transiting Neptune was on my Sun-Moon midpoint, symbolizing the dissolution erosion, goodbye, marriage, right? Very, very strong. So that was one transit. And I know you won't be able to recognize that yet, but that's, put a pin in that, because that is a boss transit. The big in your face boss transit that you could probably see when you look at this. Venus, the ruler of my 7th house of marriage, transiting Uranus, ingressed or went into the sign Aries on the day I got divorced. And you can see my Venus is 4 degrees Aries, but the fact of Uranus exiting Pisces and going into Aries, and the fact that, remember my natal, Uranus is on my 7th house cusp. And what's the nature of Uranus? Sudden. So after 4 years, the judge wakes up that morning and says, you're not leaving until you're divorced today. He forced it suddenly. Boom. Uranus conjunct Venus in the 12th house, locked us into the courtroom. 12th house, literally. He was so annoyed. He was over it. And so I suddenly got divorced after a 4-year divorce battle on that day. And the marriage eroded with the Neptune to the Sun Moon midpoint. But there are a couple of other boss transits. Pluto is applying to oppose my Mars, which is the ruler of my chart. Ascendant, descendant axis is active, and Mars is angular. Angular planets are very loud and important, and Mars is my chart ruler. So the orb is not quite there yet, but it is moving towards an opposition to my Mars, and it is separating from the square that it made for 2 years previous, the square to my Venus. So I got married when transiting Pluto was trine my Venus, triggering this greatness in my Venus-Pluto opposition. I married a wealthy man. But then when Pluto in the sky was squaring my natal Venus, and it had just finished its final hit, so it was gone now. It was separating, which meant I was done losing all the money I lost and spending all the money I spent. That symbolized the death of the marriage, Pluto square Venus, against the Pluto-Venus opposition in my natal chart. Venus rules the 7th. And believe me when I tell you, I spent a significant amount of money just to go through the divorce. And I am not a wealthy divorcee. I built my own business and had to go my own way. It was a battle. I lost everything. I went from rags to riches to rags through this divorce situation. And you can see that fight and that battle symbolized by just the transits. And on the day that I got divorced, just some more supporting transits. Transiting Mars was conjunct Jupiter. Jupiter rules legal matters, moving it along. And transiting Mercury was conjunct Venus, the contract, the divorce contract. And Uranus was there stimulating it. Sudden, done, today. Good stuff, right? So now, let's make a prediction for Maria. And I'm introducing you to a time search. I don't know how we're doing on time here, but. So here's a time search copy. And remember I said when I prepare a time search, I'm doing the transits from Jupiter through Pluto against the personal planets and your birth chart. So that's shown in the time search here. And you can't see what I highlighted because the highlighted points didn't come out in the handout. But if I came to you and said, you know what, I've had a really hard year. This year, 2021, I've had a lot of loss. I've had multiple health issues. I lost a great love. I had a traumatic betrayal and lost a great love. I had a lot of hardship in 2021. Can you tell me, please, dear astrologer, is there love coming my way? Is there a new relationship coming my way? Now, I know you may want to be nice and say, yeah, sure, there is, but you got to prove it. You got to be technical. You cannot make a prediction just because you want to be nice to someone. So let's look. My question, when will Maria meet a new love interest that leads to a relationship? If I even will. So you can look and see that right now through early 2022, it's a no-go. It's a no-go because I've got Pluto square the ascendant, Pluto square Uranus. Uranus is on my 7th house cusp. That's finishing up, and that was 5 mathematical hits, my friends. 5. That's the final one that you're looking at in November of 2021. I'm still not out of the woods because in February, I have transiting Saturn square my sun. The sun rules the 5th house. So you're not going to, your 5th house has to be active in a happy, supportive way on some level to meet somebody, fall in love, start dating. I've got Saturn blocking it. And what you don't know is that right now I also have solar arc Saturn square my sun and progressed Sun conjunct my Saturn. So I have multiple Saturn blocks to my 5th house ruler. So that, and the Saturn energy is also contributing to some of the health stuff that I went through, but that's a different predictive analysis, which we're not going to do. I tried to keep it fun. So am I doomed, or is there love potential here? Let's look. What are the rules for predicting a new love that could lead to a relationship? Because that's my question. So we have to see 5th house activity. That's where you meet someone and fall in love. You have to see 7th house activity for it to turn to a relationship. And you want to see what's going on with Venus because Venus rules love. So that's where you're looking in someone's chart. And sure enough, something interesting starts to happen after April 30th, which I have written down. There is a solar eclipse widely conjunct my sun sign. It's almost 7 degrees, so it is wide, but it's opening up the door, I think. Solar eclipse conjunct my sun on April 30th, ruler of my 5th. Opens the door, but nothing's happening just yet. Then we start to see transiting Saturn. Saturn's a staff transit, right? Not a boss transit. Saturn is going to trine my Uranus. Uranus is on my 7th house cusp. That could possibly bring something stable to my normally unstable love life. Saturn on the 7th house natally. But when is it going to happen? Well, look at June, guys. June 1st, transiting Jupiter. Jupiter is a staff transit, not a boss transit, but Jupiter is conjunct my Venus. That's interesting. On June 22nd, Uranus makes its first conjunction to my sun, ruler of my 5th house. That's a boss transit. That boss transit is happening. The rest of the boss transits you couldn't understand yet because they are progressions and solar arc directions, but I did put them down in case you're interested as you start to learn more. Solar arc ascendant is equal to my moon, which basically puts the moon on the 7th house cusp at that time in June, when we're looking at here for when I might meet someone. My secondary progressed moon is trine sun, ruler of the 5th house. And I didn't write down that solar arc sun equals Venus. Sun Venus progressions, solar arcs are just notorious for relationship dynamics. And my secondary progressed Venus is conjunct my sun moon midpoint activation. So those are the other boss transits happening, but you can look at the boss cycles, rather progressions and arcs, but you can look at those transits. And I want to know when I'm meeting someone, what's going to trigger it, guys. What's going to trigger it? Well, what's going to trigger it is the fact that transiting Venus will be conjunct my sun and conjunct transiting Uranus on June 12th. And that is a trigger. That is a trigger time. It's going to wake up all that Uranus sun potential. It's going to really wake up the Jupiter on the Venus, everything. So it does look like there is strong potential for love and a new relationship in this June arena. I'll have to let you know. This is predictive astrology at work right now. And another corroboration, if you go to the next slide, remember I told you about solar return charts. The sun is so important. It's the planet to look at in a solar return chart, 1-year chart. I cast my solar return chart May 7th. It happens the day before my actual birthday next year, 2022. Where is the sun? It is exactly conjunct the 7th house cusp, exactly conjunct Uranus. Uranus is natally on my 7th house cusp, and it's next to the North Node. Boom. That is the cherry on top of the predictive ice cream sundae. If you were my astrologer, you can see there is, in fact, strong evidence astrologically for a new relationship coming into Maria's life, most likely in June. Now, we looked at golden years. We looked at the golden year of my marriage, marrying rags to riches, having that amazing life change, traveling the world, having everything. That was transits of a golden year example. We are now going to look at transits of a crisis year. And this is a good friend of mine who I am watching her go through this right now. You can look at her chart very quickly. She's also a Taurus sun. So then when we get to the BiWheel, we see that something very, very difficult happened for her. Her mom passed away. Her mother passed away. And within 10 days of her mother passing away, she broke up with her boyfriend of 3.5 years. Very difficult crisis situation. Her mother was in El Salvador when she passed away, and my friend was here in the United States. Her mother passed away very quickly from COVID, got sick. She was elderly, very quickly happened. It was a very difficult time for her. And then her boyfriend, instead of her getting the support that she thought she could have emotionally, that relationship exploded within days of her mother's death. This is a crisis. And you're seeing an example of it in the transits. The fact that, you're not going to predict death. This is my spiel on predicting death. Can you see death in a birth chart? Absolutely. Can you predict it? Yes. But what you're predicting are the soul's exit points. The soul chooses which exit point, not you, not the astrologer. But an astrologer can see potential exit points. And I always say in a tongue-in-cheek way to my students, I predicted my own mother's death 3 times. I was only right once because I don't choose. I don't choose, the soul chooses. But you can see evidence of something as difficult as the passing of a loved one in a birth chart. But be very sensitive and compassionate and aware before you go and make predictions. So now, we see the death, we see the breakup. Very clear in just the transits alone. Boss transits. Transiting Neptune square her Venus. Venus is mother, physical mother. Venus is love. And Neptune square Venus, she literally lost her mother and her love at the same time. Transiting Uranus, conjunct the sun. Sun rules men in a woman's chart. Sudden changes happening to her life because of the sudden breakup with her boyfriend. And then we have transiting Saturn is both square her sun and conjunct her moon, symbolizing the grief. The moon rules her 5th house of romance. Saturn to the moon symbolizes the grief, loss of the mother as well. And on this day, transiting Venus was conjunct Mercury. Mercury rules her 7th house cusp. And transiting Sun is conjunct her natal sun, stimulating the Uranus transit, the big boss transit that's happening for her. And you can see that Neptune is moving towards a conjunction to her ascendant. It's not there yet, but it is noteworthy because it is exactly square her Venus. It's moving towards a conjunction to her ascendant, and that could be interpreted as an additional boss transit. So we're looking at my friend's time search now, who's going through a crisis year, and I'm ending your class now on a bit of a dark note to teach you something. That if it's not there, it's not there. And you really have to be true to these cycles and learn how to do so with compassion, but you have to be true to the mechanics. My friend wants to know, am I finding love in the next year? And we have to look. And you can see that this is clearly a crisis year that is continuing for her for a while because Neptune continues to square her Venus. Uranus starts to square her moon. Uranus is conjunct her sun. Those are all boss cycles that are hard, difficult cycles. And then Saturn square the sun, Saturn conjunct the moon all year. So that really does say, and I put the first hit, the second hit, and the final hits on the side for you to see how I write that down. It is not a year for love for my friend, and it will continue to be a crisis year. So what do? How do you help someone like this? You want to guide your clients to always access the higher vibration of the planetary energy that is working against them, that's causing all the crisis and problems. So high vibration Neptune stuff, art, music, film, photography, beauty, meditation, spirituality. You counsel your client to do high vibration Neptune when they're going through a hard Neptune transit. That's one example. High vibration Uranus. Reinvent yourself. Do something different. Take online classes. Study astrology. Okay. Start a YouTube channel, a podcast, a website. High vibration Uranus. So these are ways to actually help your client get through those crisis years that you may see. And I will end the class on transits now. Hopefully you guys have a lot to work with, a lot to learn with, but the delivery of information during your predictive astrology work is so important. I hope that there's going to be a whole other class on it, because this was a technical, mechanical lesson on transits in predictive astrology and how to be an accurate predictive astrologer. But that's only one half of the equation, guys. It is your duty, your calling, if you're going to do this work, to not only be as accurate as you can be, but to be as ethical and compassionate as you can be in your delivery. And I am certainly not perfect. None of us are, but keep that in mind when you deliver the information. And I did give you some general guidelines for delivery of information during consultations that I'll end with, which is always allow your client to bring their astrology to life. Let them tell you their story. They need to. Never make anyone feel a victim of their astrology, but at the same time, always honestly and compassionately deliver the information to the best of your ability, even if this is about the potential shadow aspects or dark patterns that are happening. If you don't know, you don't know, guys. You are not God. You are not the be all end all. None of us are. Be humble enough to let your client know that you can't answer a certain question for them if you do not know the answer. And so one of my teachers, Noel Till, always quoted Albert Einstein's, "Genius is knowing what's important." And it is so true. Genius is knowing what's important when you are looking at a birth chart and trying to make these predictions. Don't think you have to talk about every nook and cranny. You don't. Trust your higher self. Trust that you're going to connect to the client's soul and deliver the information that they're meant to hear. You don't want to overuse jargon unless you're talking to a total astrologer, astrology buff, but telling a random client that Pluto's square his or her Venus is not helpful. What does that mean for your client? It's your job to break that down. And last but not least, when you are doing predictive work, relax, okay? This is a conversation that you are having with another soul about a language you are taking the time to study well and continuing to study all of your life. So the only expectation that you should hold yourself to is that you're going to be helpful and not harmful in your discussion. Anything else is gravy. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to transits and that it was helpful. And thank you so much, Stormie, for the opportunity of being one of the teachers on your team.